For today, let me get this all here. I'd like to introduce Professor Tim Hossler. He's a former in-house art director for photographer Annie Leibovitz, and he helped Miss Leibovitz create some of her most memorable images, books, and exhibitions in the late 90s and through the early 2000s. Tim holds a degree in architecture from K-State University from 1993 and an MFA from Cranbrook Academy of Art in 2005. He has held the positions of Director of Design at Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art and the art director of the Wilsonian Florida International University in Miami Beach. He currently teaches design here and design history, photo culture, and visual communications at the University of Kansas. And for the past couple of years, or is it 3 years?
3 years, yeah.
For the past 3 years, he's had a winter study abroad program to Cuba, to Havana, Cuba specifically, and to Miami, and looking at architecture, the visual culture, and the ways in which those elements have come to kind of influence the way that we think and conceive of these areas, right? And he's going to be speaking a whole bunch more about that here today. So, without further ado, Professor Tim Hossler.
Great, thanks. Thanks. So this is the title of my little lecture. So do you know what they call a quarter pounder with cheese in Havana? Does anyone know where I'm kind of referencing or where I've taken that from?
Pulp Fiction.
Okay, Pulp Fiction. So I'm just going to show you, start off with a little clip, just to kind of, anyone who hasn't seen it, you can kind of get a feeling of what this is about. Just to set it up, so John Travolta and Samuel L. Jackson, they're hitmen. They're coming from a crime, and this is a Quentin Tarantino film, and all of his films are known for these like kind of rambling dialogues. And so this is just a dialogue that they're having in the car.
You know the funniest thing about Europe is what? It's the little differences. I mean, they got the same shit over there that they got here, but it's just there. It's a little different.
Example.
All right, well, you can walk into a movie theater in Amsterdam and buy a beer. And I don't mean just like no paper cup. I'm talking about a glass of beer. And in Paris, you can buy a beer at McDonald's. And you know what they call a quarter pounder with cheese in Paris?
They don't call it a quarter pounder with cheese?
I mean, they get the metric system. They don't know what the fuck a quarter pounder is.
What do they call it?
They call it Royale with cheese.
Royale with cheese.
That's right.
What do they call a Big Mac?
Big Mac's a Big Mac, but they call it Le Big Mac.
What do they call a Whopper?
I don't know, I didn't go to Burger King.
Okay, so I rewatched that like just a couple years ago, and I realized like that's what my whole research has been. Somehow, when I was like early in my career after high school or after college, seeing that movie somehow maybe that made some kind of connection with me, I guess. So here it is again. So the lines that I thought were really interesting, where he says, "What's the funniest thing about Europe?" It basically says, it's the little differences. I mean, they got the same stuff over there that we got here. It's just that there's it's a little different. I think it's those little differences that make traveling, make going to a different culture really interesting. I also want to talk about this word, observation, because I think this is what a lot of my work is about. So there's two definitions for observation. One, it's the action or process of observing something or someone carefully in order to gain information. So it's really about looking and gaining information. It's also a remark, statement, or comment based on something one has seen, heard, or noticed. Sometimes, especially when I'm like researching Cuba or researching another country, sometimes I kind of question like, what justifies my looking at a different culture and analyzing it? I'm not Cuban, I'm not Latino, I speak very little Spanish even. But what kind of gives me, I guess, I don't know if it's the right, or what gives me, I guess, the justification for doing that kind of research? And I guess my reasoning is, for the most part, is as a designer, I make visual things. So I do have this connection with visual creators of other countries, because we sort of do the same thing. We're interested in the same thing. And so I think, also thinking about being an observer. I'm not a researcher is like a sociologist or anthropologist. I'm a designer who's interested in stuff, in researching that kind of thing, looking at history, being interested. Okay, so I'm going to go to Havana, but through Paris and London. So several years ago, I came to the design department and I proposed a study abroad program called Comparing Cultures. And the idea would be that we go to 2 different places over a summer break or a winter break, 2 places that are very close, but also very, very distinct. So the first one was we did Paris and London in the summer of 2014. And this is some of the things we were looking at. So on the left is basically Paris, on the right is London. So we were looking at everyday things. So we were looking at money, we were looking at kind of the breakfast or coffee rituals or tea rituals. We were looking at the subway. So not just the subway inside it, but also the subway on the outside. We were looking at even like what the street sweepers look like, what the everyday person on the street, what their uniform was. And even though they're doing exactly the same job, right, there's a different visual look to what these people are doing. We were looking at buses, how the buses look different. We were looking at how signs are different. I mean, they're serving the same design problem, or they're fixing, or they're dealing with the same design problem about how to get to some place, but yet the fonts are different, the signage is different, the color is different. We started looking at people in the street. What do everyday people wear on the street in Paris compared to London? What does McDonald's look like? This kind of gets back to what do they call a quarter pounder with cheese? McDonald's, in some ways they look the same as what they do in the US. In some ways they look the same from one country to another. But in other ways they're slightly different. What does Chinatown look like in Paris compared to London? So I guess just kind of going back for a second. So a couple of things we noticed. One question I asked my students, I said, what color is Paris? What color is London? We kind of felt like that Paris was kind of beige and blue. We felt like that London was more kind of brick color and green. We noticed that the streets were a little wider in Paris. We noticed that the sidewalks were wider. The streets were wider in London, the sidewalks were wider in London, which meant that you actually had bigger dogs in London compared to Paris. Which again, this is just an observation. It's not scientific, but it was just things that we were observing. And so that's what I really tried to get the students to do. Try to look and see, and through this comparison between 2 similar places, that was the way to really bring out those differences. So the next year I decided that I wanted to kind of take that same comparing cultures idea and apply it to Miami and Havana. So before coming to KU, I lived in Miami for 5 years, and I really enjoyed it. I loved it. When I was in Miami, I always wanted to go to Cuba, but just it never quite worked out, and it's never been super easy since the Cuban Revolution, since the early 1960s, for Americans to go to Havana. And it seemed like doing a study abroad was like one of the best opportunities. So just to give you an idea, so Miami, Havana, super close to each other. Miami to Havana is about the same as like from here to Wichita, so super close. A lot of the same culture. So you have the Cuban exile community in Miami has had a huge influence culturally. So you have Cuban coffee, you have Cuban restaurants, you have a lot of Latin culture, music, but yet so far apart. So we've done study abroad trips the last 3 years. So the first time was 2015. This was 2 weeks after President Obama made his announcement that the US and the Cubans were going to try to become closer. We had already had the trip planned, and that just like came out of nowhere. We had no idea that was going to happen, which is pretty amazing. 2017, we came back 2 weeks before Trump was inaugurated. So there's a very interesting two-year kind of span that we did this trip. I'm not going to really talk about Miami, but I just want to talk mostly about Havana. Havana, I think there's a lot of ideas about what Havana is, right? So especially as an American, most Americans probably haven't been to Havana, haven't been to Cuba. So we kind of have this whole idea of what Cuba is like. Some of that comes from covers of guidebooks, possibly. There's other images that help kind of define what visually we think Cuba is like. There's also a series of books. It's called Ruin Porn. You'll see books on Detroit about that. You'll see it on Cuba. You know, it's this idea of the beauty of decay, about photographs of buildings, photographs of, you know, the streetscape, where mostly it's kind of empty. There's not very many people in it, and it's really just about looking at these amazing buildings, but in states of decay. But here's a couple things about Havana that we have noticed in a couple years. It's on the water, so that makes a difference, right? So it's a coastal city, it's a port city. You don't see much advertising. The advertising you do see is for the government. You see these three revolutionary figures quite a bit. You'll recognize Che. They do have old cars. Not only do they have old 1950s cars, but they also have a lot of 1970s, 1980s, early 90s Eastern European cars and Soviet cars. So you have a lot of Lada cars, some Yugos, cars that we really never saw in the United States. So it's a really interesting mixture of that. And yes, you do see all these cars that are just kind of like hacked together. They do anything that they can to keep them running. Yes, you do see a lot of decay. So you see buildings that haven't been painted for a long time. You see buildings that are falling apart. But you also see these amazing mid-century modern buildings. This is the Hotel Riviera. There's another one of these little subtle differences. These are the telephone booths. If you've been to Brazil, you'll recognize kind of that same shape. I know at least Rio had those. Yes, there's a Chinatown in Havana. And yes, there's tourists, mostly Canadians and other Europeans, but yes, there are tourists in Havana. I think as an American, that was one of my first thoughts. I thought that since we're cut off from Cuba, I always thought that Cuba was cut off from everything else too. One of the first professors I met in Havana, he asked me what I thought about the Coen Brothers movies, which I had no idea that they would have seen these movies. But they seem to be much more informed about us than we did of them. So through this research, I've been working on a book called Looking for Havana. It's a little bit kind of like that Looking for Godot, where I'm kind of in search of this elusive what defines Havana, which I may or may not find, but at least I'm trying to find it. And this book is going to be made up of some stories. And so again, these are like observational stories. One of the first ones is about swimming pools. Havana has some amazing swimming pools. This is the Havana Hilton. Oops. This is a hotel, or not a hotel, this is actually a restaurant that is in a building that's right next to the American Embassy. So the American Embassy is actually there on the right. We went to this restaurant my second trip, I think, to Havana, and I walked into it and I knew I'd been there somehow. Like I'd never been to it, but it just felt like kind of that deja vu kind of feeling. And then I realized that I had seen this Errol Flynn movie from the late 1950s called The Big Boodle. And that actually was filmed there. But the interesting thing about swimming pools in Havana, we discovered, was that you have the beautiful swimming pools in the tourist areas, and then you'll go to this. This is basically their Olympic diving center, and it's empty. Even this pool at the Hotel Nacional was empty. And I guess it's such a normal occurrence. This is a Cuban short film called The Swimmers, which is all about a swimming coach who has to train his swimmers outside of the pool because they have no water in their pool. Even Hemingway's house, the pool is empty. So there's this story about, I think it was Rita Hayward. She came to visit Hemingway. She swam nude in the pool. Hemingway looked out and said, "I will never drain that pool from now on." But unfortunately, it's drained. So it's another dry pool in Havana. Monuments. Like most cities, monuments, not only do they kind of stand and represent history, but they also kind of represent the people who put them up. This was put up at the very end of the Batista government, so in the late 1950s, just before Castro came to power. This Christ statue. Columbus landed on Cuba, so he's memorialized with statue. And this is Jose Marti, who's a revolutionary who spent quite a bit of his time actually as a journalist in New York City. He helped organize the revolution in the late 1800s. He comes to Cuba, his very first battle, rides out, gets shot, and he's dead. But he's one of those figures that he's a hero both to the Cubans and to the Cuban exile community. So you'll see his bust all over Cuba. You'll also see it in Tampa, in Miami, any other place where Cubans are. So this is in the National Museum of the Revolution. This is in Chinatown. This is another house or another school. And again, connecting it to Cuban film, this is called The Death of the Bureaucrat, which is a film from the mid-1960s. And it's actually a movie that's about a man who develops a machine to make these Jose Marti statues as fast as he can. The machine accidentally kills him, and then his family buries him, and they accidentally bury him with the ration papers. And so it's a comedy, it's a black comedy about the family trying to get back their ration papers. This is another Jose Marti statue in Havana. This was put up right around the same time as Elian. There was a battle between the US and Cuba over this small young child who was found at sea, brought to Miami to live with his family there. The father in Havana wanted to bring him back. There was a fight, and then Elian comes back to Cuba. So this is Jose Marti holding a child, and then he's pointing at the US Embassy. Other revolutionaries that you'll see all over the city. But then there's these strange monuments that you'd be surprised at. This is Abraham Lincoln. He's also in the plaza of the Revolutionary Museum. Another place where Abraham Lincoln is. And then another place where Abraham Lincoln is with Jose Marti. Here's the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Park. If on the opposite side of this plaque, it's a monument to Malcolm X. So something I never had expected seeing in Havana. This is pretty not surprising. Hemingway was a huge presence in Havana. This is at the Floridita bar, a life-size bronze statue of Hemingway that you can stand next to and get photographed by. This isn't that surprising either. Lenin, a large bust of Lenin in Lenin's Park. But this Lenin actually is surprising. There's another Lenin Park in Havana. It's for John Lennon. The Beatles' music, rock and roll music, was really kind of outlawed in the 1960s. But it was huge. There was a lot of bootlegs, a lot of music that people know about. But then the government changed enough so that in the early 2000s, Fidel Castro actually opened up this park, that it was that kind of official. And then missing monuments. There's two monuments I just want to show you that are missing, and I think that says something about the culture. This is the monument to the very first president of Cuba, Palma. He was the one who gave over Guantanamo Bay. So at the time of the revolution, he wasn't too well thought of. So revolutionaries toppled over his statue. They got him down, but they didn't get his shoes down. So on top of this pylon, or the pillar, is the bronze shoes. This is another monument. This is a monument to USS Maine. This still stands, so on the right is the way it currently looks. After the revolution, they tore the eagle off. They just felt like that was a little bit too American, so they took that off. In the 1960s, Pablo Picasso promised that he would make a dove, a peace dove, to go on top of it. Unfortunately, that was never done. And then lastly, souvenirs. So souvenirs, I think, are another way of looking at a country, seeing what they, kind of what symbolizes them. This is the hat for the main baseball team in Havana, which is basically the New York Yankees of Havana. Obviously, the Che shirts are all over. Dolls, the currency, Cuban cigars in their packaging, the beer. I mentioned that there's very little advertising. There's also very little variety in Cuba. So the government owns almost everything, or is in control of almost everything. So you have two beers. You have Cristal, which is a light beer, and you have Bucanero, which is the dark beer. So really the whole question I'm asking myself is, what makes a place unique? And what I'd like to give you right now, I'll pass these out. If you could just kind of pass them around. Thank you. Right, let's take one. So I just want to give you this. I thought this was a good way of just having a conversation about what makes places unique. So I'd like to just look at this first side first. So the one that says, do you know what they call a quarter pounder with cheese in Havana? And so I'd like you to just take a second to answer this first question. So what do you think Havana is like? This could be based on maybe you've been there, maybe you already have an experience with Havana, maybe you've seen some movies about Havana. I think we've all heard about Havana in the news, right? So we all probably have like some kind of idea. It may not be right, it may not, be the way it really is, but at least we have some kind of idea. And I'd like you also think about what informs that thought. Is it a movie?
What's actually right, Tim?
I'm not gonna. You don't have to hand this in. So this is more for you. But if you want to jot down, that's great too. And while you're thinking about that, so one of the projects I do is I have actually Paul Stock, who's here, who teaches in environmental studies and environmental studies and sociology. He was a professor that went with me on this last trip, so we team did this trip, which is great. Emily from the Commons is another contributor on our trip, which was great. But what we did was we gave the students this list. And what they had to do is either through photography or through writing. During the trip, they had to somehow answer these questions. So the first one was show something typically Havanian, which I made that word up. What color is Havana? Show something you weren't expecting to see in Havana. Describe the sky in Havana. Describe the water in Havana. Capture a tourist in Havana. Show something you bought or found in Havana. Document the neighborhood where you stayed. It says, can you see Havana from Miami? Document a meal in Havana. Describe the environment. What time is it in Havana? Photograph the future in Havana. And show the space between Havana and Miami. So those were the questions that students had to kind of answer. There was also a series of questions about Miami that were basically the same, just about Miami. I'll just show you just quickly. We had an exhibition at the Commons. Oops. This was our exhibition called What Time Is It in Havana, Cuba? This was our exhibition. It was just big, large prints of students' answers to these questions. On the floor, in vinyl, we put the actual questions on, so you get an idea of kind of how students answered them. Okay. So on this first question, what do you think Havana is like? Does anyone have any big insights? Has anyone ever been there? Okay. Emily, what do you think Havana is like?
I think it's resourceful.
Okay. Okay.
I saw a documentary and it was talking basically about engineers and doctors and how much they make compared to other people, and doctors, they're literally like your local neighborhood friend down the street. And,
Right.
I mean, they don't really get paid very much.
Yeah.
And engineers, they have to work 2 or 3 more jobs as well. So that's one thing.
I mean, from our experience, that's what we found too, is that surprisingly you'll have a cab driver that's actually a doctor or an atomic engineer, because anyone who's connected with the tourism industry can make much more money than anyone working at any other place. Yeah. Okay.
Did you have your hand up? Oh, me, yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay.
I don't know, when you think of kind of big cities in the U.S., Kansas City, New York, whatever, you can walk down the street and see a bunch of different restaurants, a bunch of different cultural influences on different parts of the street. Whereas when you think of Havana, you kind of think of just Cuba. Like my influence has been really just hearing about politics and Cuban jazz. I listen to
Okay.
a lot of jazz, and I kind of think of Havana as like just Cuban food, Cuban music, Cuban people. It's just that like there's not a whole lot of outside influences, not a whole lot of variety.
Okay.
It just seems like essentially Cuban.
Yeah. How many of you seen the movie Buena Vista Social Club, or know that music? Okay, that was a movie probably, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago or so. It was a documentary about it was a documentary about Cuban musicians, mostly who, at the time the film was made, they were old. So it was music from another generation. But it's the kind of music that you hear every place in Havana where there's tourism. But when you start walking around the streets, what you end up hearing is you hear Jay-Z, you hear Katy Perry, you hear like all this American pop music. So I agree, like that was definitely what I thought Havana was gonna be like. But then you get there and you realize like Cubans are from like such an interesting mixture of people. You have African influences, you have Spanish influences, you have
There's a Chinatown.
you have Chinese influences.
When I went.
Yeah, and that's amazing. You know, you do have this like influences of cultures that you're not expecting. Okay, what else about Havana? Yeah.
I'm basing this off because I was in Brazil for like half the year this year.
Okay.
And my girlfriend lives there. And like, it seems similar in architecture and stuff, kind of to like Brazilian architecture, like that Latin American architecture.
Okay.
But like, even from the pictures, like, it's a lot safer, like peaceful, it's a lot cleaner than Brazil.
Okay.
Like, from what a lot of Brazilians said, a lot of other Latin American countries and like their experiences, it's a lot cleaner. It looks a lot cleaner and safer. And like
Okay.
even Brazilians like told me how they brought over Cuban doctors to educate their doctors because they're some of the world's best doctors.
Yeah.
Like, so it seems like Latin American inspired, but like comparatively it seems a lot safer to like what I experienced.
Okay, yeah. You know, I always have, when students are getting ready to come on this trip, there's always a lot of parents that have this concern, like about safety. You know, because for Americans, Cuba's always been sort of, you know, they're part of the evil group, or they're part of the, you know, they've always kind of been our rivals. They've, you know, you think about the Cuban Missile Crisis, you think about their connection with Soviet Union, you know, they've always been the bad guys, for Americans at least. But what we try to tell parents and students is that, you know, actually Havana is going to be a lot safer than Miami. So, you know, I think that your observation of that was very correct.
There's no homeless people in Cuba.
Yeah, I mean, you do see people begging, but you just don't. I think with communism, in some ways, it does level the playing field somewhat, you know, and so that you don't have the homeless, you don't have the poverty that I think probably you had before the Cuban Revolution, and the poverty you might see in other countries, or even the U.S. Okay, what else about Havana? Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I guess I just pictured there wouldn't be much there.
Okay.
I'm not really sure why, but I also kind of back to the music. I always think of like Desi Arnaz and his band on I Love
Sure.
Lucy. That's what I always picture. So.
Yeah. You know, probably it's a generational thing about sort of what connections you make, or what as a kid you watch growing up. I watch a lot of I Love Lucy, and I think that's really interesting. But it's also really interesting thinking that's Cuba in the 1950s. You know, so that was a different kind of Cuba. That was when Havana was basically Las Vegas. You know, that was where Americans could go. You didn't have to have a passport. There were car ferries, so you could go from like Key West to Havana with your car. You know, there was a lot of corruption. There was like, you know, a lot of mob influence. So Havana at that time was a very kind of glitzy place for American tourists.
Have you guys seen Guys and Dolls? Anybody seen Guys and Dolls? That scene where they go off to Cuba.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, what else? What other influences do you think? So we talked about I Love Lucy. It's kind of an influence. Any other influences you think of?
In regards to
Maybe things you've seen or movies you've watched, or like here's an example. I think 2 years ago, my former boss, Annie Leibovitz, photographed Rihanna in Havana. So it's a cover of Vanity Fair. So it's a, you know, it's a photo spread of kind of exactly what you'd sort of expect of Havana. You know, crumbling buildings. Rihanna's sort of, you know, pictured in a cafe that's falling apart. She's pictured in an old 1950s car. You know, kind of all the things that kind of go with that stereotype. Yeah.
The Godfather Part 2.
Okay, that's another one. So that takes place right at the time of the Revolution. Those scenes. Has anyone ever seen the movie Bananas by Woody Allen? Okay. So it's not specifically about Cuba, but it's definitely about Cuba. You know, where he actually goes to a Latin American country. He ends up kind of being mistaken for the leader of the country, and it's a very Woody Allen kind of movie. But obviously it's about Cuba. Yeah.
Everyone's probably going to cringe when I say this, and I'm cringing as I'm saying it. But like, I watched a Keeping Up with the Kardashians episode.
Okay.
They went to Havana like for the first
Right.
time, whatever, and they just talked about, and I got to see like it was almost like encapsulated like from time and like everything just looked like the pastel cars and the crumbling. It just looked so like straight out of the 1950s or 60s. So that was
Okay.
really cool for me to see.
Yeah.
Despite that it was via the Kardashians, but
Right.
I don't know. So that was kind of cool.
Okay. Yeah, I've seen the pictures of them like in the back of a car with a selfie stick taking a photograph. Yeah. How many of you seen the newest Fast and Furious? Okay, so that has a scene in Cuba, right? You know, I think for the most part, most movies, those kind of things kind of help reinforce those stereotypes of what we already think about what Havana's like. And that's what I think, again, is like the greatest thing about being able to travel someplace and actually have your own observations, is that you actually are able to walk on the street, hear people's conversations. Something I've been inspired by is, it was a group called Mass Observation. It was started in England in the 1930s. And the idea was, as a group, how could they sort of keep and like archive things about culture that aren't usually kept? Things like jokes, or home recipes, or photographs of how your house looks, your living room looks. And so what they decided to do was basically what these questions are. Every year they come out with a series of prompts asking people to basically do it for them. So they ask people to photograph their living room, or they ask people to write down their best jokes. And then it all gets submitted, all gets cataloged, and it becomes an archive of kind of everyday culture. Okay, I'd like you to flip over to the other side. So this is kind of the time where I'm going to ask you to sort of do what I've had students do. So I'd like you to think of a city. So that city could be, it can be Havana if you want, but most likely it would be maybe a city you live in, or grew up in, a city you visited. It could be any place. And then I'd like you to think about these questions for it. So the first one is, what is something typically associated with your city? What color is your city? Describe the sky in your city. Describe the man-made environment in your city. Describe the natural environment in your city. What is the best souvenir from your city? And what is your city like at night? What are some characteristics of the people in your city? What time is it in your city? And has history been kind to your city? Okay? So I think we have a few minutes, but I mean, just as we kind of finish up today, I'd like you to just think about that. Does anyone have a city they want to think about? Yeah.
Chicago.
Okay, Chicago. What color is Chicago?
What color is Chicago?
Yeah.
Blue. I'd say it's between black, green, and blue.
Okay. And what makes it those colors?
Blue for the lake, black because a lot of the skyscrapers are that color, green because they have, what's the number? They are one of the major cities with the most parks
Okay.
in the world. So there's green space all around the city.
Okay. What time do you think it is in Chicago? Like time, what I mean by that question is, like, like I think of, like, my thought about Miami. Miami to me feels like the 80s, right? Because of Miami Vice. So I always have that connection with it. I mean, there's also some futuristic qualities about, that Miami, like maybe it's 2020 or something. Havana, I think for the most part, we usually think it's stuck in the 50s. You know, there's parts of Havana that are stuck in the 30s. There's, you know, all different time periods. I think about the city I used to live in, New York, that there's areas in New York that, you know, if they're doing film shoots, if they cut out the cars, basically it looks like early 1900s, or it could be 1860, you know, because the buildings really aren't that different. So I think each place in some ways has its own time place that it can kind of be in, right? Okay, who else has another city? Yeah.
Los Angeles.
Okay. What time or what color do you think Los Angeles is?
I see it being blue, silver, and gold.
Okay.
So blue because, well, silver because of the skyscrapers, and then blue because of the reflection of the sky off those skyscrapers.
Okay.
And then gold because of the Lakers.
Okay. It's funny how I think sports teams actually, the branding of sports teams can have quite a bit of connection with like what color we associate something with. In my design class, I asked my students what color they thought Kansas City was. And almost everyone said blue. You know, it was all because of the Royals. You know, for some reason they weren't Chiefs fans, I guess. But they were thinking about the Royals. Is there another question you think goes well with Los Angeles?
I think, what is your city like at night?
Okay.
Depending on where you are. It's either very lively, it can be very quiet, it can be very ominous.
Okay.
Depends on where you are.
Okay. Cool. Okay.
I kind of like this idea of time stopping, or at least from the outside, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as you say, right, Cuba, there's this perceived stop. Therefore, we look at it and associate it with that period of time. And we maybe think of Miami, as you say, in that 80s position. And I think of Wichita, Kansas, so if anyone's from there, if you've been there, one of the things that at least that you grow up there kind of thinking about is the way in which it feels like it's in the past, right? There's this perceived point in time where it stopped innovating, where the city just kind of was and it hasn't changed, and you look around and you don't see any changes for something. Maybe that's typical of a Kansas city or town or something like that, but it's interesting, this idea of, and it feels that way, and it's pervasive to the point where I guess if you live there, you feel like it's not going anywhere, and you don't see those things around. And yet now I'm away, living here in Lawrence, moved in other places for a few years, and so as I go back, it's interesting as I do, because there's more of, when I get down to the question of what are some souvenirs, there are apparently Wichita flags. If anyone's from here, and you may also know that I don't think that existed. I'm pretty sure that flag did not exist, except it did, I think.
I don't remember it growing up.
I don't remember it at all, but if you go down there, you will see it on cars, you will see it on businesses, you will see the flag flown everywhere. And recently, I was here on campus, and I saw someone drive by, and they had a Wichita flag sticker on their car, and I thought, what is going on? But the point is that now feels like there's this culture attached to this flag somehow, and you see it in more, let's say, hipster types places, like places that are becoming more prideful of their town, because there is this perception among younger generations that this is a place that is stuck. And so they're latching on to a symbol, and this new, and so that's something that's like coming to mind, and I think it's where you see it, right? Because that symbol becomes associated to nightlife, right? You'll see it at a bar or something like that. So these questions, I think, come to that for me, is like, where are things stuck, and then how do people resurrect something out of the past?
Right. I used to live in Brooklyn, and there was a point where everyone was wearing these 718 shirts, which was the zip code or the area code. And I mean, now it's kind of doesn't really matter, but at the time, like, that was kind of a big sort of like, I'm from Brooklyn kind of way of connecting with people, and that became the souvenir. So think about souvenirs. Does anyone have a city that has a great souvenir? Okay.
Street art from New York.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, that's great. Paul?
Leaning Tower of Pisa.
Okay. Nice. Yeah.
So I'm from Indianapolis, or Indiana, and
Okay.
I don't think that there's a specific like piece that you take with you from Indianapolis, but going to a place, I consider it like your souvenir.
Okay.
That's walking the Brickyard at the 500. That's kind of like what Indianapolis is known for, and so I mean, you can take a momentum with you from there, but you kind of get the experience is your souvenir.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, similar to that. I'm from Omaha, Nebraska, and like instead of just a souvenir that defines it, everyone just knows us for like having a really great zoo.
Right.
So like that is the one thing you do when you go to Omaha, or like the College World Series in the summer. But yeah, mainly just our zoo. I would say it's similar. It's more like an experience that people take away after as a souvenir. So.
Right. I mean, it's what the place is known for, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Any other great souvenirs?
Yeah, but I'm trying to think. It doesn't exactly fit what you were saying, but I mean, it kind of does. So my grandma's from London, but she grew up in like Devonshire, so it was a little ways off, and it kind of goes with the history, kind of what he was saying about it. Like what a lot of people don't think about in England is you just drive out of the metropolitan area of London, and you can go back 500 years in these villages. And her house she grew up in is like built in the 1600s or so, and some of it was just like it was, and some of it was modernized. But from that village, we'll go almost twice a year, but we'll have these like things people in the town will make, whether it's quilting or some things are, I would call it bull ringlet quilting, it doesn't interest me, but some things like that. So you'll take the things people have handmade, and those will be your souvenir as opposed to something just commercial that you find in a major city.
Yeah. It's very unique to that place, probably.
Yeah, absolutely. Very unique.
I was lucky enough. When I was a student, I studied. I spent a semester in Italy and then traveled around Europe. It was right at the time when the Berlin Wall had come down, only a couple years before. So traveling to Berlin, that was like the greatest souvenir you could get. It was like a chunk of the Berlin Wall. And at the time, like we didn't have anything to take any chunks off, so you had people on the streets with tables with a bunch of chunks. And so I have these chunks, and it's like I don't really know if it's from the real wall. You know, it came with some like Xerox like certificate, meaningless. But you know that like I have this, and it's like it doesn't really matter to me if it's from the real wall, but at least it was a chunk that I bought in Berlin. So good enough, I think. So. So anyway, thank you so much for letting me come again. This is my second time, which is really great to do. And thanks for being really attentive. Thanks.